Good morning. Today, inshallah, we're going to start a new system, which is the cardiovascular system. And this cardiovascular system presentation is dedicated to juniors, as you see on the slide, because there is a more elaborated one that is being taught in human biology in grade 11, but I thought it would be good for you, especially that not all of you are going to take human biology next year, that they know a bit about the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system, as its name indicates, studies the heart and the blood vessels. So cardio stands for the heart and vascular stands for the blood vessels. So we're going to actually study the heart and the blood vessels, how they are interrelated and how they serve important functions in the human body. And as you know, a system is a group of related organs that carry out together a particular function or a group of related functions. The diagram you see on the first slide is a diagram for an ECG strip or electrocardiogram, and it is one of the diagnostic tools in cardiovascular medicine, meaning that there is a device and you connect that device through leads to the patient and you apply electrodes to record the electrical activity of the heart. And you finally get a strip of paper on which you have this tracing. And through this ECG tracing, you can know whether the heart is beating at a normal rate or not. You can know whether the heart rhythm is regular or irregular and what might be the cause of this irregularity. But you can also know whether the blood vessels that supply the heart muscles with blood are adequately open and supply the heart with adequate amounts of nutrition and oxygen or not. And all this will be studied throughout the presentation. First of all, why do we need a cardiovascular system? We need a cardiovascular system to provide oxygen to the tissues. And why do we need oxygen? Because most organisms on Earth cannot get their energy unless they are provided with energy. So the main purpose of getting oxygen is getting energy for all our vital processes like brain activity, like muscular activity, like active transport everywhere in the body. So actually, do all living organisms require require oxygen in order to get energy? Living organisms are divided into three groups of organisms. Or actually, at the beginning, we can divide them into two broad groups, the aerobes that require oxygen and the anaerobes that do not require oxygen in order to get energy and that can produce energy in the absence of oxygen. But of course, the amount of energy that is produced anaerobically in the absence of oxygen would be much, much smaller than the amount of oxygen that is produced under aerobic conditions in the presence of oxygen. And that's why most anaerobes that can require in the absence of oxygen are small organisms or one-celled organisms, whereas most multi-celled organisms and higher and more developed organisms are aerobes. Coming to aerobes, aerobes require oxygen to get their energy, but aerobes are divided into obligate aerobes that can survive only and produce energy only in the presence of oxygen. Of course, you understand that if energy is not available for the vital processes in the body, then the organism might not be capable of continuing life. On the other hand, we have the facultative aerobes, and facultative aerobes means that they are essentially aerobes, but they might refer to anaerobic respiration and anaerobic production of energy whenever the conditions require this or whenever oxygen is not available. Okay, so what's the relation between oxygen and the production of energy in aerobic organisms? You all know that oxygen is essential for production of energy in aerobic organisms, and you also know that food stuff that we eat, especially carbohydrates, are essential for giving you energy. Okay, the carbohydrates will be digested in the digestive system, and after having been digested, they will produce the simplest form of carbohydrates, which is the monosaccharides. Of course, you know that the monosaccharides are three major monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, and galactose. But you also know that the most abundantly ingested or the most abundantly present monosaccharide in all the carbohydrate stuff that we ingest is glucose. So glucose is the most abundantly carbohydrate that is used for production of energy. Glucose is present in your blood. It's after having been digested and absorbed in the small intestine. Glucose reaches the blood, and then glucose will pass through the cell, will pass into the cell in order for the cells to be capable of extracting the energy in glucose. Of course, in order for glucose to enter the cells, it needs a hormone that is called the insulin hormone, as you know, and it needs insulin needs specific receptors on the cell membrane in order to open the glucose channels or carriers, because glucose is a big molecule and it needs a protein carrier to carry it into the cell. When glucose enters the cell, it is partly broken into the cytosol of the cell. It is partly broken into the cytosol of the cell in a process called glycolysis. But that glycolysis produces a very small amount of energy. So if we have one molecule of glucose that is broken in the cytosol through a process called glycolysis, it will produce only 2 ATP molecules. Of course, 2 ATP molecules store a very small amount of energy. But the rest of the ATP molecules, which are about 36 ATP molecules per glucose molecule, will be obtained only when glucose enters an organelle inside the cell that is double membraned, and that is called the mitochondria, and where all enzymes for cellular respiration and breakdown of glucose are present. And mitochondria, in the mitochondrion, one glucose molecule will release the rest of the stored energy, and this stored energy or this energy that is released will be stored in 36 ATP molecules, and therefore most of the energy extracted from one glucose molecule will be produced in the mitochondria and will share in the formation of 36 ATP molecules. And as you know, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is the energy currency of the cell, and it is important for storage of energy. So how is this energy released from glucose? This energy is released by certain biochemical reactions that break down the bonds inside glucose. You know, the chemical bonds between carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a glucose molecule store a good deal of energy, and that's why glucose is a good source for energy. So when you break down those bonds in the mitochondrion, this energy is released. This process of breaking down bonds in the glucose molecule inside the cell inside the mitochondrion, in order to produce energy is called cellular respiration. And respiration is not breathing. Respiration is the breakdown of bonds to release energy. Breathing is the mechanical movement of inhalation and exhalation. So breathing is a mechanical movement, but respiration is a chemical a process that occurs in the cell where we break down bonds to release energy. Okay. And as we said before, this energy is used for active processes like electrical activities of the brain. Whenever you solve a math problem, whenever you reflect on a question in biology, then your brain cells require energy. Whenever you move a limb, your muscles contract and need energy. Whenever your heart contracts and beats, the cardiac muscles require energy. So that's why we need oxygen. But if the cells require oxygen, then this oxygen that is breathed in from the atmosphere and reaches our lungs so the oxygen is breathed in via your nasal cavity and then the nasopharynx and then reaches the lungs. But this oxygen that has reached the lungs is required to reach all the cells of the body. So we need a transport system to transport that oxygen from the lungs to all the cells in the body. And this is the function of the cardiovascular system. It is to transport oxygen to the tissues. But as we have just said, energy is not only a matter of oxygen. Oxygen alone cannot provide you with energy, but oxygen shares in the breakdown of the glucose molecule. So you should have some foodstuff that is rich in energy, an energy-rich compound, and you require oxygen. Why do we require oxygen? Because breakdown of the glucose molecule is associated with the release of electrons, and electrons are accepted by oxygen in the mitochondrion. So if you don't have oxygen, then there will be no molecule to accept the electrons that have been released from the glucose molecule upon breaking down the bonds. So when you break down glucose bonds, it's true that you release energy, the stored energy. You release the stored energy, but you also lose electrons. These electrons have to be accepted or caught by a molecule, by an electron acceptor. Otherwise, they would return to the glucose molecule and we wouldn't be able to extract the energy from glucose. So the presence of oxygen in the mitochondrion is important because oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the process of cellular respiration, final electron acceptor. This idea of oxygen being a final electron acceptor has been said now because I just want you to understand the relationship between the need for oxygen and the breakdown of glucose. I know it's a bit more advanced than grade 10's level, but I hope you have understood it, and it's important to know it in order to know why is it that important to have oxygen in the process of cellular respiration. Now that we agree that oxygen is essential for the process of aerobic cellular respiration, then this oxygen has to be transported to the cells. If you have unicellular organism or a one-celled organism like amoeba, for example, that lives in freshwater environments like lakes and rivers, then the oxygen that is dissolved in the water in the fresh water would simply diffuse into the cell of amoeba to fulfill its requirements of oxygen by simple diffusion from the water where it is present in higher concentration to the amoeba where it is present in lower concentration. Why is oxygen lower in concentration in amoeba? Because it's all the time being consumed by amoeba cells in the process of cellular respiration. So every amount of oxygen you give to the amoeba will be consumed, and it, despite all the oxygen it receives, it will always have its inside the cell having less oxygen than the outside. So for amoeba, it's very easy to get the oxygen because it consists of one cell and it is surrounded by oxygen from everywhere, and there is no problem of there isn't the problem of transportation of oxygen. But if we talk about a complex organism, a multicellular organism that consists of many hundreds or thousands of cells, then the superficial cells will receive oxygen easily by diffusion. The superficial cells will receive oxygen easily by diffusion. But what about the deep cells in the center of the organisms? The deep cells cannot receive oxygen by diffusion. Why? Because it is possible, but it would take an extremely long time. So what's the problem of having oxygen taking a very long period of time reaching the central cells of a complex higher organism? The problem is that this low speed of oxygen diffusion cannot cope with the high oxygen requirements of the organism. And that's why such higher, more developed, more complex organisms require a transport system that contains a pump like the heart. We should have a pump, and that pump will have vessels connected to it, and those vessels will contain blood where oxygen will dissolve, and this oxygen will finally reach the cell. So you require a pump to generate pressure, and this pressure is capable of transporting blood that carries oxygen or where oxygen is dissolved to distant areas. Just like when you have a motor for a building that consists of like a very high building, then you require a motor to pump water upstairs. So we generate pressure through the heart, which is the pump of the cardiovascular system, and we need transport vessels that are the blood vessels, and we need a transport fluid that is the blood. And actually, oxygen is dissolved in a particular compartment of the blood, which is plasma, because you know that blood is consisting of plasma, red blood cells, and other cells like the white blood cells. And actually, oxygen is mainly carried in blood combined to the hemoglobin inside the red blood corpuscles. You know, hemoglobin is the red pigment inside the red blood corpuscles, and we have a small amount of oxygen that is dissolved in plasma. About 2% of oxygen are dissolved in plasma, whereas about 98% are inside the red blood corpuscles, and they are bound to a protein molecule called hemoglobin, where in the center we can bind oxygen molecules. So what is the need for hemoglobin? We discussed the need for oxygen, we discussed the need for a transport system, and now we discuss the need for hemoglobin. As we said before, we have blood vessels, and these blood vessels contain blood, liquid blood, that looks like this under the microscope. So you have those small spherical structures that are biconcave that are called the red blood corpuscles, and you have the white blood cells and that are mainly concerned with immunity. They do not carry oxygen, and you have fragments of cells that are called the platelets and that are mainly concerned with clotting of blood whenever needed. If you have a wound and that wound is bleeding, then the platelets will secrete sticky substances that will help the platelets adhere to each other and will help the blood be converted from a fluid to a semi-solid in order to plug the wound and prevent any further bleeding. Actually, the red blood corpuscles are red because they contain a molecule, a pigment that is called hemoglobin. And since hemoglobin can bind with oxygen, every hemoglobin molecule can bind with 4 molecules of oxygen, then we call hemoglobin an oxygen carrier. But meanwhile, we can also call hemoglobin a respiratory pigment because it helps delivering. First, it is a pigment because it's a protein that is colored. It contains iron and other components that make it look red. And it is respiratory because it helps carry oxygen to the cells. And when cells receive oxygen, they carry out cellular respiration, and this is the cause why we call hemoglobin a respiratory protein. Why do we need white blood cells? As we said before, white blood cells are helpful for fighting pathogens, and therefore they are helpful for defensive mechanisms of the body. And if those defensive mechanisms are specific to a particular antigen or bacterium or virus or pathogen, then we call it immunity. So the defensive mechanisms in the body can be non-specific, directed towards any pathogen in the body, in which case we just call them defensive mechanisms. But if a particular pathogen is targeted, then it's no more general defensive mechanisms, but immune mechanisms or immunity. Whether you're talking about general non-specific defensive mechanisms or specific immune mechanisms, they are carried out by white blood cells. And we have 2 types of white blood cells, the B cells and the T cells. The B cells are mainly concerned with secretion of antibodies that will be directed towards the antigens of the pathogen, and an antigen-antibody reaction will occur, resulting in destruction of the pathogen. But the T cells are mainly concerned with direct killing of the pathogen without production of antibodies, but by production of chemicals. So direct killing of the pathogen by secreting chemicals that are called the cytokines. On the other hand, we have the platelets, as we said before, and the platelets are fragments of cells. And when you have a kind of injury, vascular injury, there is activation of the endothelium, activation of the inner cells because they are cut. So when they are cut, there are chemicals, and those chemicals result in aggregation or gathering of the platelets together, as you see. And the platelets, once they are gathered and activated, they start secreting sticky substances that help formation of a clot. And a clot is a semi-solid structure of the blood that helps plugging the injured blood vessel and therefore stopping bleeding. As we said, we require a transport vessel for rapid transport of blood. But blood vessels are not only important for rapid transport of blood, but they, first of all, before helping transport, they prevent leakage of blood, because if you don't have, there are some lower organisms like insects, for example, like cockroaches, that have an open circulatory system. So the blood will diffuse among the cells. The blood will leak outside the cardiovascular system in a different system, a system that is totally different from our cardiovascular system, that is a closed circulatory system. What do we mean by a closed circulatory system? This is important to know. We mean by this that the pump that is the heart will pump the blood in blood vessels, and blood will always be contained within the pump and the blood vessel. So the cellular components of blood, like the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets, under normal conditions, will never leak outside the cardiovascular system. Maybe the fluid part, which is the plasma, can exudate outside the blood vessels, especially the capillaries. The capillaries are the only place where there is exudation of plasma. Other than this, blood stays contained in a closed circuit. This is what we call a closed circulatory system, and it is characteristic of higher organisms like human beings and other mammals, higher vertebrates, but there are open circulatory systems. So in a closed cardiovascular system, there will never be leakage of blood. You might only have leakage of plasma, and only in the capillaries, because as you know from your study of the urinary system, we have exudation of plasma through the capillaries, and the capillaries are fenestrated, and through the fenestrations of the capillaries are the only place where plasma can leak for purposes of transmitting oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and taking back dissolved carbon dioxide and waste. The blood vessels have another important function other than transport and other than forming a closed cardiovascular system. They allow fine-tuning of the volume of blood that reaches the tissues. I'm not sure whether we discussed this before, but you know that we have the heart, that is a pump, and then arising from the heart, we have the large arteries, and then we have the medium-sized arteries, and then we have the small arteries. So we have medium-sized arteries, and then small arteries, and then we have the arterioles. And the arterioles will branch into capillaries, and then the capillaries will unite to form the venules, and then the venules will give rise to small veins, and then the small veins will give rise to medium-sized veins, and then to large veins, and then to the heart. So this is the hierarchy of the cardiovascular system, or the hierarchy of the blood vessels. In the arterioles, especially in the arterioles, we have this property of having smooth involuntary muscles in the wall of the arteriole. So if these muscles, this is a section in the arteriole, and this is the diameter of the arteriole. So if the muscles in the wall of the arteriole are relaxed, then the arteriole is dilated. It is dilated, and it has a relatively wide diameter. But if the muscles are contracting, if the muscles contract or are contracted, then the arteriole is constricted, and the diameter becomes smaller and narrower. So how does the arteriole do this? The arteriole does this by receiving orders from the nerves. Sometimes the nerves give order to the arteriole to relax, and sometimes they give orders to contract. When do they give orders to relax? When we need more blood, a greater volume of blood to provide more oxygen and nutrients. When do they give orders to constrict? When we need less blood, when we need to minimize the blood that goes to a particular organ that might seem weird. Why would we diminish the blood that goes to a particular group of cells? Maybe because these cells are less active now, so we wouldn't waste our energy sending them a lot of blood. Or maybe those cells are injured and the blood vessel is leaking there, so we should minimize the volume of blood that goes to that leaky blood vessel in order to minimize the loss of blood. What we see here, the diagram we see here on the slide, is the arteriole is an arteriole. So this is an arteriole, and this is a venule. So here we have a venule, and this is the final arteriole, and in between them we have the capillary bed. And as you see, the side of the capillaries that are towards the arteriole and that are called the arteriolar capillaries carry oxygenated blood that is rich in oxygen and that is bright red in color, whereas the other side, which is the venular side of the capillary, carries the oxygenated blood because after blood has passed on the cells, these are cells in between the gaps of the blood capillaries, they consumed a great part of the oxygen, and that's why upon reaching that side of the circulation, we will have deoxygenated blood that will return to the heart and then to the lungs in order to be reloaded with oxygen and unloaded from carbon dioxide. So as you know, by definition, an artery is a blood vessel that carries blood from the heart to an organ, whereas the veins, by definition, carry blood from an organ to the heart. And we have just said that the only type of blood vessels that have fenestrations and that allow plasma to leak, of course, it is a controlled leakage of plasma, then this plasma that leaks to the cell, that leaks outside the fenestrations of the blood capillaries to the cells, is not empty plasma, but it is plasma where there is a lot of oxygen and nutrients dissolved. Otherwise, other than the blood capillaries, all the other blood vessels in the vasculature of the heart or in the cardiovascular system do not have fenestrations, do not allow leakage of plasma, and therefore do not allow exchange, do not allow delivery of plasma loaded with oxygen and nutrients. That's why every group of cells in the blood should be surrounded by a very extensive network of blood capillaries. So capillaries are fine blood vessels, as you see on the slide. They are fine blood vessels that connect the arteries to the veins, as we have just seen on the previous slide. They surround individual cells, and sometimes some tissues are so richly supplied with blood that every cell is surrounded by minute, very small blood capillaries. And we have just said that they are the only blood vessels that have pores or fenestrations in order for fluid to be filtered out of the blood capillary carrying oxygen and nutrients to the cell. Now, at the tissues, there is a kind of exchange between blood and the tissues, and we call it capillary tissue exchange. If you look here at a blood capillary having fenestrations and having a net fluid movement out, of course, this occurs we have just said that every blood capillary has an arteriolar end that is connected to an arteriole. So the blood is coming towards the arteriole and then into the capillary, and has a venular end where blood has gradually become deoxygenated, and that is connected to a bigger venule that carries blood back to the heart. At the arteriolar end, we should have fluid coming out. Why? Because we need to deliver oxygen and glucose to the cells. Here are the cells. But at the venular end, we need fluid to move in again. So the plasma that we have, or the plasma that exudated outside at the arteriolar end will come back or will re-enter through the venular end in order to carry carbon dioxide and waste substances that resulted from cellular respiration. And this is what we call exchange. We are giving out, the blood is giving out oxygen and nutrients, things that are useful to the cell. The cell uses oxygen and glucose to break down the bonds of glucose and release energy. But unfortunately, there are waste substances like carbon dioxide and other waste substances. So these have to leave the cells, otherwise their accumulation would be toxic to the cell. They leave the cells, they find themselves again in the plasma, and the plasma returns to the blood at the venular end, carrying carbon dioxide and waste. That's why we call it deoxygenated blood. And that's why the venules will carry back this deoxygenated blood to the heart and then to the lungs. This exchange at the level of the tissues occurs between the blood capillaries from one side and the cells from the other side, and that's why it is called capillary tissue exchange. And by tissue here, we mean the cells. But in order for this to occur, as we have seen before in our study of the urinary system, the blood capillaries should be well adapted to this process of exchange. The process of exchange requires the blood capillaries to be thin-walled, because if you have a blood capillary like this one, these are the endothelial cells that line the wall of the blood capillary, and there is blood inside. So, and these are the cells in the wall of the blood capillary, and here is the blood. So if you want plasma to leave outside, to be exudated outside, exudated to come outwards, carrying oxygen and nutrient to the tissues. So first of all, the wall of the blood capillary should be thin. Capillaries should be thin-walled. And as you see here, capillaries are thin-walled because they are formed of one layer of endothelial cells. Imagine if we had several layers of endothelial cells, they would crisscross each other and prevent the leakage of plasma outside. But fortunately, the blood capillaries are made of one layer of cells. The second adaptation of the blood capillaries is that they should be fenestrated. So the first one is thin wall. The second one is that they should be fenestrated to allow for exudation. The third one is that they have to be numerous. They have to be extensive. We should have an extensive network of blood capillaries that surrounds all cells in the body in order to increase the surface area and therefore facilitate and speed up the process of diffusion. Actually, what occurs is diffusion. Oxygen diffuses outside or outwards, and carbon dioxide diffuses inwards. In order to ensure that the capillaries are thin-walled, it's not only enough to have their walls made of one layer, but they should contain no muscles at all. Why are we saying this? Because the rest of the blood vessels, like the large arteries, the medium-sized arteries, the small arteries, the arterioles, the venules, the medium-sized veins, the large veins, are all contain smooth muscles in their walls with different ratios or with different quantities. The only blood vessels that do not have muscles in the walls, smooth, of course, involuntary, and the only blood vessels that have fenestrations in their walls to facilitate exudation and diffusion are the blood capillaries. The exchange we've just talked about at the level of the tissues is called tissue capillary exchange, but there is another exchange in the body that is called alveolo-capillary exchange, and it is necessary to complete the function of the cardiovascular system. This exchange occurs in the lungs. You know that your lungs consist of spongy tissue, and that spongy tissue is because there are air sacs in the lungs or alveoli. The singular is alveolus, and the plural is alveoli. And those alveoli contain air that is compressible, and therefore the lungs have a spongy appearance. Those air sacs are full of air all the time, so they are expanded, and then when you inhale, they are expanded, and then when you exhale, they diminish in size, but they still have some air even upon the strongest exhalation. There is always some residual air that stays in the alveoli or in the air sac. They are never completely empty from blood. And surrounding each alveolus, we have blood capillaries. And of course, that sounds logical because we need some kind of exchange to occur between the blood capillaries and the air sac. So we call it alveolo-capillary exchange, meaning that we're talking about the exchange between the alveoli, alveolo-capillary exchange. So it is an exchange between the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries, and that type of exchange occurs in the lungs. What's the main purpose of alveolo-capillary exchange that occurs in the lungs? The main purpose is to load the blood with oxygen, or actually unload first. So it is to unload, and I'll tell you why, unload the blood from carbon dioxide, whose accumulation in the body would be harmful, and to load the blood with oxygen that is required to produce energy in the body in the process of aerobic cellular respiration. Why have I started by unload the blood from carbon dioxide? Because as you know, the blood that comes to the lungs is deoxygenated. It comes to the heart first via the large veins, and then the heart sends it to the lungs to purify it. And I would rather not use the term purify that you always use, because we're not actually purifying blood, but we are unloading it from carbon dioxide. So what happens actually, that if you have blood that is rich in carbon dioxide that reaches the capillary that is around the air sac or the alveolus, then its concentration in the blood will be higher than its concentration in the air sac, and it will diffuse down concentration gradient from the blood to the air sac, and then it will be expelled outside the body. Meanwhile, the alveolus is full of oxygen that comes from inhalation, and that oxygen therefore has a higher concentration, and it has a higher concentration in the air sac, and it will diffuse down concentration gradient to the blood. So we have two processes actually that are essential and that have to occur at the same time and all the time, and that are complementary to each other, and they are necessary to achieve the process of energy production in the body. Of course, as we said before, in order for you to achieve all this, you should have a pump that generates relatively high pressure in order to allow this blood to be transported in the blood vessels. Not only this, but in order to allow that blood to circulate at a speed that is appropriate or suitable to the needs of the body of oxygen. And in order for the heart to act as a pump, it should contain muscles, and we call those muscles collectively the myocardium. So the myocardium involves all the involuntary cardiac muscles. And by the way, the cardiac muscles under the microscope are striated, having dark bands and light bands. So they are striated and they are branched, and I'll show you how, and they are interconnected. Why are they interconnected? Interconnected because they need to contract simultaneously. They need to contract simultaneously. They need to act as one unit. So they need to contract at the same time. And when they contract at the same time, they give a more powerful contraction, and therefore they give a more effective contraction. So how do they look like under the microscope? We have a cylindrical muscle like this, and that cylindrical muscle has dark bands and light bands, and it is branched. And the different myocytes, a myocyte is a cardiac cell, myocyte, a cardiac muscle cell. The prefix myo refers to the heart, and the other one is also striated, and you see they are connected so that they can act as one unit. And it is considered, the heart is considered as a double pump, because as you see, half the heart carries oxygenated blood and pumps the blood in the arterial side, and half of it carries deoxygenated blood and receives blood from the veins. But there is another reason why we call the heart a double pump, because the right ventricle, this one, the right ventricle, this chamber, will pump blood to the lungs in a very short circulation that is called pulmonary, referring to the lungs, pulmonary circulation. And meanwhile, the left ventricle, which is this one, will pump blood around another bigger system that involves most of the human body, and that is called the systemic circulation. Okay. Of course, we will discuss the heart chambers in detail, but in another coming video. Thank you, guys, and you'll be receiving a short assignment on this part we have just explained. Thank you, and see you later.